Hey guys, Indie Explorer here, and welcome to my first ever game review. Today I'll be discussing Metroid Dread, and be warned that this is a spoiler review, so if you haven't played the game yet, I would highly recommend doing so before you watch the video. Let's get started. Metroid Dread is the first main entry in the franchise in 14 years and a direct sequel to Metroid Fusion, which was released 19 years ago in 2002. Since many of the old Metroid games have become notoriously difficult to play due to a lack of support on new hardware, I've only had the chance to play Super Metroid, part of the original Metroid, and the Prime trilogy. However, I'm very familiar with the story running through the other entries, including Metroid Fusion, which I'll go over briefly here. One of the biggest reveals in Fusion is that Metroids were genetically engineered by the Chozo to control the even more deadly X-Parasite, which has the ability to possess living hosts and take on their appearance, abilities, and memories. When Samus destroyed all of the Metroids on SR-388 in Samus Returns, she unwittingly opened the gate for these parasites to return to the galaxy, and in Fusion is infected and nearly killed by one. She is saved by a Metroid-derived vaccine and spends the game fighting off other parasites aboard the BSL station. At the end of the game, the ship crashes into SR-388 and it is believed the X-Parasites died out with it, but at the beginning of Dread, it is revealed that at least one survived on planet ZDR and, being immune to the parasite thanks to her Metroid DNA, Samus is the only one who can investigate the threat. Full disclosure before we dive in, I really enjoyed Dread and think it's a fantastic conclusion to the 2D Metroid saga. That said, it's far from perfect, and I wanted to explain why in context of the greater body of Metroid games. I'll first discuss what I liked and feel are Dread's strengths, followed by its shortcomings, as well as some of my own solutions regarding ways in which it might have been improved. As I compiled my thoughts for the video, I noticed a pattern in the breakdown of what I liked and didn't like in the game, and this can be summed up in two words: action and atmosphere. While every Metroid entry has both elements, the primary draw has always been exploration, not combat. The Prime games are even officially considered first-person adventure games, not first-person shooters, even though that is the central mechanic. The appeal of Metroid games has never been shooting up aliens, but rather exploring alien worlds in isolation. It is curious, then, that Dread is the first main entry in the franchise to prioritize action over atmosphere, and while I think that focus does lead to some notable strengths, it's a double-edged sword that also weakens the game and has negatively impacted many players' experience with it. Let's break down each of these elements, starting with action. Simply put, the action in Dread is phenomenal. This is by far the most polished, fluid Metroid game by a wide margin, as it should be since this is 2021 after all. The controls are smooth, responsive, and fairly intuitive, though it admittedly takes some time getting used to the various alt-fire modes. Combat is satisfying with a wide variety of enemy types and an emphasis on melee counters, which increases the depth and skill expression of what would otherwise be a pretty simple system. I also think the boss fights are excellent. Every boss is a challenge, but the attacks are well telegraphed, and once you learn the attack patterns, each encounter becomes an elaborate dance that is quite satisfying to beat. This is a significant step up from the boss fights in Super, most of which devolve into skirmishes of attrition in which you just have to whittle the boss's health bar to 0 before they do the same to you. I also really enjoyed the Emmy zones, or rather, dreaded them, which is great because that was the whole point. This was the only truly unique element of the game, and the idea of instant kill enemies against which Samus is powerless was an interesting subversion that I thought was well executed. I especially appreciated the change in pacing the Emmys brought, as the zones had to be played very differently from other areas of the game. I do wish that the Phantom Cloak had been more useful and that these zones placed more emphasis on stealth, however, rather than simply making a mad scramble to the nearest exit. Because the duration is so short when moving and your mobility is drastically reduced when using the cloak, you can't get very far without burning exorbitant amounts of energy. And if every Emmy zone is going to turn into a chase sequence anyways, I'd rather not bother with stealth at all. That being said, the movement in Dread is so fluid that dashing through the Emmy zones is thrilling in its own way. Perhaps the standout strength of Dread for me, though, is that it's a game that respects your time. Relatively quick loading times, plentiful save stations, and autosaves before every Emmy door and boss door ensure you're never taken out of the action for long and keep the game feeling fair. I think it's safe to say that Dread is technically the hardest Metroid game. You'll certainly face more game over screens than in any other title, but because the design is so efficient, it doesn't feel that way and is ultimately more accessible. The game experience is specifically tailored to get you back into the action as soon as possible, and it honestly feels great. Let's move on now and discuss the second element, atmosphere. First, I wanted to touch on the story. Going into it, I wasn't expecting all that much since Metroid games tend to have pretty simple stories, and Dread more or less met my expectations in that regard. There were some genuinely surprising twists and satisfying story beats that I think work very well though. The idea that a faction of Chozo would want to weaponize the Metroids makes sense, and falls in line thematically with the other games in which the Space Pirates and Galactic Federation try to accomplish the same thing. Also, I know that this has been criticized a lot, but personally, I thought that the transformation of Samus's DNA to full Metroid was kinda warranted after the events of Fusion, and I'm very interested to see where the franchise goes with that in the future. Another element of the story I really liked was the classic silent portrayal of Samus Aran, and I was especially impressed at how well the developers were able to communicate what she was thinking and feeling through only her body language and facial expressions. And I've gotta say, that single spoken line of Chozo was absolutely perfect. I care a lot about accurate characterization in games, and props to Mercury Steam for nailing it on this one. My only real disappointment with the story was that the X-Parasite didn't play much of a role at all, and was mostly just used as a plot device. The X's escape from Elune felt like a big deal when it happened, but despite literally every organic life form on the planet being replaced from that point on, it didn't seem like anything had changed in a meaningful way. Moving on from the story, my biggest criticism of the entire game is the biome diversity, or lack thereof. Case in point, each of the following images is taken from a different area of the game. Now compare them to these images taken from different areas of Super Metroid. Just kidding, these are all taken from the same area, Brinstar. The contrast speaks for itself, and if we include all the other biomes of Zebes as well, it becomes even more striking. The world of Dread just doesn't have that much variety. Most egregiously, the first three areas of Dread, which happen to be the largest, are also the most similar. Each one is primarily factory, with a little bit of rocky exterior and a little bit of lava. But it gets even worse. Out of 8 total areas in the game, only 1 is truly unique. Arteria, Cataris, and Dyron are all extremely similar. Ferrania and Elune are visually a little different, but functionally identical. Burania and Hanubia are the same, which leaves only Gavarin. Compounding this problem even more is the fact that the Emmy zones are literally identical, being practically copied and pasted 6 times. Since these zones take up so much space in relation to their respective areas, it makes each area feel even more similar than they actually are. Gavarin was by far my favorite area of the game, not only because it was unique, but also for the simple reason that much of it takes place outside. I'm honestly kinda baffled as to why the designers chose to make nearly every area the interior of a building. Other biomes are present in the game. The background of Elune is shaded mossy cliffs, while the background of Ferrania is windswept desert. But it doesn't really matter because the level keeps you trapped inside a building the whole time. Part of Elune could have, and I think should have, been like the Criteria in Super Metroid, with high cliffs that can only be reached with a space jump. Ferrania could have been similar to Meridia, with twisting animal burrows and underground swamps, and I would have loved to see a return of the beloved quicksand mechanic. On the topic of variety, there are some temporary biome changes that worked very well, but proved disappointing because they were just that, temporary. Dyron starts out very dark with no power, showcasing the bioluminescence of the local fauna and Samus's power suit, but your very first order of business in the area is to turn all the lights on. I would have preferred that the area stay dark the entire game, and maybe there could be an ability later on that let you see in the dark better. In this sense, it could have been like the Moldwood Depths in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and I think the Emmy Zone in particular could have benefited from this adjustment. The other temporary change is that, fairly late in the game, the lower parts of Arteria and Cataris freeze over, which dramatically changes both the look and accessibility of each area. I thought this was really cool, a clever way to freshen up and add difficulty to early game areas that the player has likely traveled through many times. Hollow Knight does something very similar to great effect. Those who have played it will know what I mean. Unfortunately, your first order of business is to, you guessed it, immediately warm up the planet again and return it to normal. I think it would have been awesome for the change to be permanent, and perhaps for the ice to gradually spread throughout all of the levels. How cool would it have been for Burania to freeze over? There could have even been a late game ability that let you melt through ice in order to backtrack for missile and energy expansions. It would have been nice to see the developers commit to this idea of evolving areas rather than using them as a temporary gimmick. Speaking of backtracking, another issue with Dread is just how linear the game is. In every other Metroid entry I've played, it is essential to backtrack in order to find the way forward, such is the case with the Power Bomb ability in Super Metroid and the Plasma Beam in Metroid Prime. Dread has none of that. The only way to go is forward, and the only purpose backtracking serves is to pick up energy, missile, and bomb expansions. There are no bonus abilities either. While thorough players of Super will be able to find the Spring Ball and Spazer, and Prime players will be able to obtain powerful charge combos like the Wave Buster, putting in extra effort to explore the world of ZDR will yield no additional abilities. Definitely a missed opportunity. Next, I want to talk about the soundtrack. Frankly, I found the soundtrack of Dread very disappointing. It's adequate, but not memorable, and is severely lacking in both personality and mood, and honestly doesn't feel very Metroid to me. Compare it to the 16-bit glory of the Super Metroid soundtrack, where every area had a unique and catchy tune that became inseparable with the areas themselves. The one standout track for me in Dread is the one played during this scene. Sound familiar? This is a callback to the Brinstar Depths theme in Super Metroid. When the most catchy track in a game is borrowed from another game, that's typically not a good sign. As I mentioned though, the problem isn't that Dread's soundtrack is objectively bad, because it's not. It's just too generic for a Metroid title. Let's compare the music of two different boss fights, starting with the Chica fight in Metroid Prime Echoes. Now listen to the Kraid fight in Dread. Both tracks are well composed, but while the former is very distinct and recognizable, I can think of half a dozen other games in which the latter could be used and not sound out of place. Finally, adding insult to injury, the last track of the entire game, the credits, is just bizarre. Listen to this. I have no idea where this theme came from. It sounds way more like a Mario game than anything remotely Metroid, and actually dampened my triumph a bit at having beaten the game. Next, I want to talk about abilities. For the most part, I thought the abilities were well designed and fun to use, and the overall progression is decent, but pacing is poorly executed. It's very backloaded, with far more abilities coming at the end of the game than at the beginning. The Morph Ball in particular is withheld far too long at the beginning, making the intro areas slower and more frustrating than they should be, and the high density of abilities at the end makes some of them feel useless. For example, the Super Missile and Spin Jump, or Double Jump, are obtained in the late game shortly before their upgrades, the Ice Missile and Space Jump respectively, making them feel unnecessary. The weird thing about this is that, in every other Metroid game, these abilities are obtained early on. Why weren't they placed earlier in Dread? Just moving these two abilities earlier would have massively helped the pacing in my opinion. Also, I'm not sure why the Power Bomb is saved until the very end. It was kinda odd to gather most of the Power Bomb tanks before getting the ability itself. Personally, I think the Screw Attack should have been last, since it's easily the most overpowered and game-changing ability. I think there also could have been an additional suit upgrade. Having the gravity suit grant water mobility, lava immunity, and cold immunity was a bit much. I think a separate cold suit would have been neat, perhaps even coming with that ice melting ability I talked about earlier. My last 2 points of critique are nitpicks, so take them as that, but I still felt they were worth mentioning. First, the game has no bonus ending for 100% completion, or even a completion percentage screen for that matter. Since this is a staple feature of the series, I simply assumed there would be one here, and it was pretty disappointing not to get one. My expectations weren't even high. I would have been totally satisfied with the cliche of Samus taking her helmet off. Now, there is a bonus piece of art unlocked in the gallery for achieving 100% completion, but honestly, that's a poor trade-off for a bonus scene. My second nitpick is that the travel cutscenes in this game look kinda awful. I mean, look at this. In a game where the frame rate is buttery smooth and rock solid the rest of the time, it's really jarring for these cinematics to look so cheap. I think it would have been worth taking the extra disk space to just render these out fully and ensure smooth playback, especially considering that the file size of the game ended up significantly smaller than originally announced. And with that, we wrap up my critique of the game, and so the final thing I'd like to do is rank Dread on a 5-category scale. The categories are as follows: narrative, gameplay, aesthetics, performance, and value. The story was fairly strong, definitely could have been more of it, but I was satisfied nonetheless, so I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Gameplay is fantastic, 10 out of 10, nothing more to say about that. I didn't talk about the graphics much, but they were certainly gorgeous and the sound design was exceptional, so the aesthetic score is just brought down by the lack of biome diversity and memorable music to a 7 out of 10. Performance was rock solid throughout, aside from the transportation cinematics, so I'll give performance a 9.5 out of 10. In terms of value, the game only takes about 12 hours to 100% on a first playthrough, so the $60 price tag is a bit steep, but the game does offer a hard mode as well as speed-based achievements, so you can definitely get more mileage out of it. 7 out of 10. That adds up to a total score of 85 out of 100. Thank you so much for watching to the end of the review, and again, if you haven't played Dread yet, I would highly recommend doing so. For all its flaws, it really is a great game and worthy conclusion to the saga that began way back in 1986. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and I would love to hear your own thoughts on the game in the comments below.